Matt Benke on, so I think he's probably not going to make it today.
Right. You can start.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our latest train trip to Cleon and the Tri-Cities today. My name is Gary Ward. I'm a board member of All Aboard Washington and a resident of Yakima, Washington. I'm retired from the Federal Aviation Administration. I managed flight programs there over the years. Yakima and Kittitas County had Amtrak service until 1981 when the Empire Builder was rerouted over Stevens Pass. And you can tell by looking at my hair that I'm old enough to have remembered that service, and I've ridden it many times. So I have a kind of a special interest in restoring the current service because I have appreciation for the need there. This is the fourth in a series of meetings that we originally were going to do live, but obviously the pandemic kind of changed all that. We were going to do them at the various station stops along the Stampede Pass corridor. But we didn't even get so far as the first one before the pandemic set in. So our purpose has been to increase public awareness of the possibility of restoring passenger rail service over the Stampede Pass route through central Washington to Spokane, and also to get more interest and involvement from our local elected officials. So we're going to start right off now. We have some various topics to talk about today, and I hope we don't confuse you, so we'll try to keep it simple. The first topic we're going to talk about are rail commissions. There's been some recent developments about a rail commission. If you're not familiar with what it is, we'll tell you what it is and what some of its purpose and some advantages and how it might help us restore a regional passenger rail service. So here to lead the discussion is our Board of Directors member, Patrick Carnahan. Patrick.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate the introduction. And thank you very much, everyone, again, for joining our meeting today. It's really an exciting time for passenger rail in the Northwest right now. There are a number of ongoing efforts in addition to the East-West passenger rail project that All Aboard Washington has been engaged with. And the first thing I wanted to tell you about is what's going on with regional rail commissions. Go ahead and advance the slide. And once more. There we are. So a little bit of background. You know, the East-West passenger rail project would be serving a corridor that hasn't seen service for a number of years now. And while we do have existing passenger rail service in the I-5 corridor, you know, All Aboard Washington is really trying to push for WashDOT and ODOT to look beyond just this I-5 corridor that sees Amtrak Cascade service right now. Service between Seattle and Spokane was actually codified in RCW 47.79.020 by the 1993 legislature, that by the year 2030, there would be high-speed ground transportation between Seattle and Spokane. And even though, you know, we would certainly be many years off from seeing anything like high-speed rail serving this corridor, we believe that there exists a great opportunity for there to be more than what exists right now. Montana, the states of Montana and Idaho, or various subgroups within them, have expressed interest in passenger trains. For example, in the Boise metropolitan area, there is interest in commuter rail as well as Amtrak service between Portland and Boise. And in Montana, a group of counties has recently created what's called the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority in order to fund service in the southern tier of the state. And in addition to all of these efforts, federal grants have been around for quite a while that provide funding for passenger rail projects, including several of the nature that this project would entail. So with all of this as background, next slide, please. All Aboard Washington has been having conversations with several people about something that would be called a Northwest Rail Commission. that in the early 1980s, the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama created an interstate compact which formed something called the Southern Rail Commission. This is a group recognized by Congress, created by this interstate compact, and then approved by the Congress to study passenger rail on a regional interstate effort, not just corridors within one state, but crossing state lines. That would also increase these states' competitiveness for federal grant opportunities for many of the grants that I just spoke about before. Each state chips in a bit of money annually, a similar amount for each state, and the governors of each state appoint commissioners, including members of each state's respective DOT, in order to contribute to these planning efforts, which allow these states to apply for a number of federal grant opportunities. It makes it so that rather than each state just getting in on its own interests, they can think more broadly and work together on corridors that benefit the entire region. Next slide. So there's been discussion recently about creating a similar organization for the Northwest, as well as several other organizations for other commissions, I should say, for regions across the rest of the country. A Northwest Rail Commission would allow for formal planning efforts between a number of different states, including potentially Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, so that corridors connecting these states could receive the planning attention that they deserve, and federal funding opportunities can be introduced that may otherwise be more difficult to coordinate. A number of different lines could be considered, and in particular, there are a number of corridors that could be focused on specifically, depending on how these organizations are, or how these commissions are structured. This would be particularly helpful for the East-West project, because while the line that All Aboard Washington is speaking of would go between Seattle and Spokane, a commission could be created focusing on federal funding opportunities for the end of the line in the Tri-Cities, which could go down to Boise, meaning that the states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho could all work together collaboratively on planning efforts for this line, among others. Next slide. So there's been a lot of discussion as a result of what's been going on in Congress as to how exactly this would work. The current Southern Rail Commission, upon which a Northwest Rail Commission would be modeled, includes 3 states, and several corridors are under consideration, specifically ones with relationship to those 3 states. However, recent discussions have considered the possibility of not just a coalition of a single coalition, including Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, but also potentially several commissions, with each one focusing on the corridors specific to those states. So for example, a corridor restoring service in the southern tier of Montana between Fargo and Spokane and beyond might feature the states of North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and Washington, while a corridor linking Seattle with Salt Lake City could feature the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Utah instead. So there are a number of different concepts for how this could work out, depending on which corridors are in focus and how many rail commissions will be allowed at the federal level. All Aboard Washington is particularly aware of the efforts which would feature the Seattle, Pasco, Boise, and Salt Lake City corridor, the Seattle, Pasco, Spokane, and Fargo corridor, the Spokane, Pasco, and Boise corridor, as well as state-supported daytime service between Spokane and Portland, which the line does exist, but only but it's funded by Amtrak and only occurs during the night on the Portland leg of the Empire Builder. Next slide, please. So with all this in mind, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot that needs to happen. We're in the early stages of creating creating Northwest Rail Commissions, and All Aboard Washington for its 2021 legislative session will be working mostly on step one, passing state enabling legislation in cooperation with at least the state of Oregon, but we're also working on how we might consider doing this with the states of Idaho and Montana. And as long as the first two states pass legislation to create the commission, then the commission is formed, and the members of the commissions can approve in their legislatures the addition of other members. This is what happened with the initial rail commission. The states of Mississippi and Louisiana created the commission, and Alabama joined shortly thereafter. The other steps, All Aboard Washington will certainly be involved with. For number two, we are currently in discussions with Transportation for America, John Robert Smith of Transportation for America, on what we can do to assist in the federal enabling legislation, which would recognize the committee congressionally. And the other steps will happen once the first two have been completed. Next slide, please. So the one of the big issues I think that we face, given our state's challenges, and this is going on across the country, is finding out how to fund it. It's not a very expensive ask, thankfully. Currently, the Southern Rail Commission states pay less than 6 figures each per year to fund their rail commissions. Depending on the extent of work that ours might do, it may be a little bit more or less. But in any case, we're going to be fighting for funding for almost everything in the state. A lot of things are on the table. So we have to look creatively at how we might be able to finance it. As I mentioned before, Montana has recently created its own Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority, which is different from the Rail Commission. What this does is this is a union of counties within the state along many of the former railroad right-of-ways, which used to see service before service was dropped in the 1970s and 80s. And they have banded together under a program recognized by Montana state law since the 1990s in order to fund capital improvements and possibly some operating expenses by funds collected by the counties. And we've been wondering if maybe a similar option would be available for the Northwest Rail Commission. And with that, we will turn it over to our own Louis Musso to speak about a similar option that could exist within Washington.
Louis, before you speak, I just wanted to make a point here. Now we're changing subjects from a rail commission to county rail districts. So they're different. As Patrick said, the commissions focus on a regional scale, whereas the county rail districts, which Louis is going to talk about right now, are county. Please, Louis, it's all yours.
Thank you. Again, I'm Louis Musso, sitting here in my living room in sun-drenched Elum today. This is going to be somewhat of a conceptual outline rather than bury you in RCW subsections and so forth. I will gladly follow up with all that sort of detail because the legislators are going to want it, but I don't know that if you want more, you can certainly ask me during the question time or just email me or wait until we put the rest of the stuff up. Basically, what we're trying for this year is the next step in an evolution that has been going on since the 1980s by the legislature of the state of Washington. There is nothing radical or even particularly new about this proposal. And so briefly, in the 1980s, when the Milwaukee Road was in its death throes and abandoning short lines all over primarily the Palouse, the state of Washington authorized counties to create county rail districts for the purpose of facilitating, saving, and improving freight rail in those areas. That passed almost unanimously, stayed on the books. In 2000, I became involved working with what was then Trend West Resorts, now the Suncadia Resort, who were very interested in passenger rail service, although at the time we were only looking at Cle Elum and Ellensburg. However, we found this bill sitting there and were able to convince the legislature in 2001 to expand it from merely freight to passenger. So suddenly we have passenger rail districts that are authorized to facilitate passenger rail service. In 2007, Kittitas County was the first and so far the only county to create a passenger rail district. So it's on the books, it exists, it's the prototype, it's the you know, whatever you care to call it. It is the one that we can experiment with or build on to make work with the others. Now, parallel to this, the state of Washington created another type of special purpose district called a public facilities district. Again, there's going to be no quiz on this. I don't expect you to remember the difference. Just remember that it is different. Public facilities districts authorized counties to create an authority that would enable them to build large projects like the Sun Dome in Yakima, the town center in Wenatchee, the arena in Spokane. All of these were built and are operated currently by public facilities districts. Public facilities districts get, over a 25-year period, 0.033, so really small percentage, 0.033 of the share of the state collected sales and use tax in those counties. Not the percent that goes to local governments. So neither a public facilities district nor county rail district takes money away from anybody's library, anybody's fire district, anybody's city, anybody's anything, only the state. And it has to be matched, a 1/3 match. So the vast bulk of the state's population already lives in a public facilities district and is already benefiting from the state's generosity in putting up that 0.033% to do various things. At the time, two things were going on. The smallest possible project that a public facility district could do was $10 million. We didn't have one in Kittitas County at the time. Neither did Grant, neither did Adams, neither did Lincoln, neither did Ponderay, neither did Ferry, neither did most of the smaller counties in eastern Washington. what we are suggesting is that any county that chooses to create a passenger rail district that doesn't already have a public facilities district would be entitled to use that same percentage and that same matching to carry out their rail projects, both freight and passenger. Now, two things need to be kept in mind. It's, pardon me, did somebody say something? All right. It's not possible to create new public facilities districts. The statute that authorized that had a definite termination. So it's not like Grant or Kittitas or Lincoln or Adams is ever going to have to choose between having a public facilities district and a rail district. There is no choice anymore, no conflict. Secondly, the thing one needs to bear in mind is that the percentage is so small and does have to be matched and remains under the control of the county commissioners. The county commissioners are the rail district commissioners under the statute. So we're not trying to create a new bureaucracy. Let us use Kittitas County as the only existing one as the example of what could be done if this was adopted. The state collects sales tax and use tax within the boundaries of Kittitas County, does within the boundaries of every county. 0.033 of that amount, using the most recent available numbers, which are going to fluctuate every year, but generally they have been going up, is about $7 million a year. Therefore, the Kittitas County Rail District would have $7 million plus the matching funds of another 1/3 to use in this respect. What could be done with that? Studies could be conducted. As a matter of fact, as this evolves, I think we will want to modify the existing draft legislation to allow any passenger rail district along a corridor to pay for the funding of economic studies, cost benefit analyses, and any federal rail commission costs that affect or facilitate that corridor. So obviously, Kittitas County can't run a train between Auburn and Seattle within its own borders. So this has to be more broadly focused. I don't think we'll have any difficulty making that modification in the legislation. So bottom line, no new tax, no new bureaucracy, simply modeling it after the same mechanism that most every other person in the state is already benefiting from. And we use that to carry out the things that need to be done. This money can be used as matching money for federal grants. It can be used for money for stations, can eventually be used if necessary as a subsidy of the fare box, and the fare box revenue can be used as part of the match. So to the extent that this proposal isn't new and isn't radical, it does allow us to do some things that we've struggled with and would probably struggle with for many years to come without doing something like this. Again, all the details you could ever want can be provided, but that's the concept. I see a question. Yes, could larger counties that presently have public facility districts also form a county rail district? Good question. Yes, they could. And they would be encouraged to. There would actually be good reason to do that. Several. Number one is again, the fact that this is a corridor, not a county thing, to the extent that we had county rail districts all down the line, Yakima being a good example. Yakima has the Sundome, so they're not going to be able to have a whole lot of money coming in because they're getting it already for the public facilities district. Not a problem. If we enter into interlocal agreements, then there's absolutely no reason why Yakima County, Grant County, no, Grant County doesn't have one, excuse me, Benton County, Franklin County, can't all participate in the governance of the corridor by the interlocal agreement of all the county rail districts. And they could also, if they wanted to, they wouldn't have to, they could also provide part of the match. So we want these to be as locally oriented as possible, but as unterritorial as possible. And under the circumstances, I don't think those are conflicting goals, because you can't run a train from Seattle to Spokane without going through all these places. And they all need to cooperate. And I think we'll be willing to cooperate because there is no competition involved. Either we all benefit and the trains run, or none of us benefit and the trains don't run. So that was a good question, and we would be encouraging, even if they can't participate in the big money from the state, would be encouraging all the counties affected to give us their support, their assistance, their ideas, and maybe even a little tiny bit of their money in order to carry out the bigger program. Did that answer the question? I hope so.
Thank you, Louis. Are there other questions for Louis while we're here? Or do we have everyone thoroughly confused?
Or is everyone just, prepared to go fight for this based on what I've said?
Well, that kind of leads us into our next question then.
It does.
Where do we go with all of this? And the same with the Northwest Rail Commission. Where are we going? So here to talk about that is our All Aboard Washington Government Affairs Director, Mr. Louis Moscoso. Louis is former co-vice chair of Washington State House of Representatives Transportation Committee and the co-founder of the Legislative Rail Caucus. So Louis, can you give us a little vision into the future here, please?
Well, I certainly hope so. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you here. It's wonderful to see on this third of our train treks the continuing interest in finding out how we can move forward. And I'm looking for the right slide here. Where do we? I think we're still moving ahead there. Okay.
No, that's too far forward. That's
I
Okay.
just real yeah, I think we got the slides in the wrong place here.
Yeah, I was
just a
thinking that
second,
Abe
Pat.
was up next.
I will find the slide number to go to.
Abe, are you ready to go? Because maybe since that's where we are.
We can swap them around if you guys want.
Yeah, okay, so Abe is next and Luis will be after that.
All right.
Okay. Okay, Abe, for those of you that are on here in our past meetings, Abe has been giving us continual detail and further information on the costs and benefits, kind of following on to the STEER study that was completed this summer, and which really has some additional factors that need to be considered. It had its limitations partly because of time and money. So Abe has been working on this for us for quite some time now. Abe is a transportation analyst at RL Banks and Associates, and he is also a board member of All Board Washington. So Abe, go ahead, please.
That's right, and a native Washingtonian to boot. I'll try to make this fast because I think that all of that talk about rail districts as well as the state rail commissions is extremely important and really represents some steps forward. So I don't want to distract from the major driving force here. But what I can do is tell you a bit more about what is being envisioned for service between Spokane and Seattle and what it might do and what we know about it. As Gary mentioned, there was a study performed over the course of the past year by a firm called STEER, and they published it recently, earlier this year. And we went through and did some very simple extrapolations of some of their assumptions and some of their findings to generate what we think an east-west corridor service would look like and what it would mean, most importantly, to the places that it would serve. So what I'm going to talk about are those draft benefits of the east-west study. I'm going to take that same method that we used to look at the east-west service and apply it to the present Cascade service. And then think more about what all of that means and the best way to make sure that we can grow those dividends into something that actually is meaningful and is noticed more in Olympia. So on to the next slide, please. So from the STEER report, they envisioned a pretty wide range of operational costs per year, $15 to $30 million in annual operations costs. And from that, we see some pretty big, interesting numbers. We think that from that, as well as the ridership numbers and the travel patterns that STEER estimated, that we would see about savings of over $30 million from car trips diverted. Across the state, we'd think we'd see about $7 million in additional visitor spending, as well as some pollution savings and quite a bit of money that would be saved on people that might otherwise take the plane. So on to the next slide, please. The initial STEER estimates, well, the way that they really envisioned ridership was they saw a total diversion from cars, which is great because cars are really expensive. What this really means in technobabble is avoided vehicle miles traveled. And overall, avoided vehicle miles traveled is pretty underappreciated because cars are expensive in all kinds of ways we don't think about. They kill a lot of people, they pollute a lot, and they're very expensive to maintain, both for the people that own them, for the counties, states, and the federal government that has to maintain the roads they drive on. On to the next slide, please. Overall, savings per a mile that you would travel in a car is pretty big. The Victoria Transport Policy Institute at North rejiggered some numbers from AASHTO, which is really the highway builder association, and they estimate that savings per mile avoided is about $2 just on wear and tear alone for every mile that you don't drive a car. Savings continue is about 12 cents a mile, as well as about, and if those passengers were to take trains, they'd roughly half their CO2 estimate. So you can go on to the next slide. On top of that, the state actually codified goals for VMT reductions in cognizance of those savings. By 2020, we were actually supposed to see an 18% drop. I think the earlier pandemic conditions may have contributed somewhat towards that, but right now, I-5 traffic is at times at pre-pandemic levels. I think, unfortunately, we should expect no different given the holiday weekend coming up, as well as the fact that there just aren't that many trains running to take people off the roads. We're only seeing 2 Cascade trains a day running between Seattle and Portland. And this just means that all the hundreds of thousands of people that rode the train in the past won't be able to do so now. By 2035, we're supposed to see a 30% drop in VMT. And by 2050, we're supposed to have vehicle miles traveled in the state. To do that, realistically, we're just going to have to provide some pretty significant alternatives. And really, both the Cascades going north and south in the western part of the state and the east and west service can help. Next slide, please. Now we're going to get a little bit into how we kind of crunch these numbers. And just to be transparent about it, I'm going to go pretty quick. Luckily for us, even though STEER just gave us a gross ridership number, they envisioned 100,000 to 200,000 people or so. And to figure where those people would be getting off, what they would do, they luckily published this. This was a survey of passengers that, or rather would-be passengers that took the train and how they divvied out between the destinations. It was really good that they included this because if we go to the next slide, all we needed to do was take the maximum number of passengers and essentially multiply it by these percentages. And so as you can see, out of the 200,000 people or so that they envision with one daily trip between Seattle and Spokane, there's a pretty good spread. You'll note that the Tri-Cities would see 17,000 people or so. Cle Elum would see around 8,000 people. Together, that constitutes a pretty significant block of people every year, especially when you consider that this is not a significant service. This is only 1 train a day. Go to the next slide, please. Now, when we get down to what that might mean for the state budget, for those vehicle miles traveled, for the enormous budget that WashDOT has to maintain the roads, you'll notice that there's actually quite a bit of savings, over $30 million saved from car trips that would not happen. This means that people going to the Tri-Cities would save the state over $3 million every year. Cle Elum passengers would save the state almost $1 million in road maintenance and accidents that they wouldn't have to clean up. Next slide, please. So as you can see, to Cle Elum, about $1 million saved annually from all the car trips not taken. And the Tri-Cities would save well over $3 million. I think the Tri-Cities is a really important destination. I mean, it's the last urban agglomeration on the West Coast without some direct connection to the national rail system. And so this would be a significant win for the state, should we pull this off. Go to the next slide, please. So, as I said, STEER really just looked at car trips. However, that's just not how rail passengers in Washington state have behaved in the past. This doesn't reflect Amtrak's own data, and it isn't necessarily representative of what ridership on the trains would actually look like. This is one of the limitations that Gary referenced at the beginning of this presentation. On to the next slide, and we'll break this down a little more. As you can see, Amtrak data says that less than half of the potential riders would actually drive. This implies that the STEER report may have actually significantly underestimated ridership, even for 1 train a day. Over 30%, about a third, would fly. 10% would use a bus. Those are the most cost-sensitive passengers. And more significantly, 11% wouldn't travel at all. And those passengers are really valuable because that means that all the money they spend when they travel wouldn't otherwise get spent. So that's pure economic stimulus from over 10% of this estimated ridership. That's a big, big win. Go to the next slide, please, and we'll talk a little more about that. So as you can see in Washington State, 11% of the people would not drive, and that is pretty big because across Amtrak ridership nationally, only 8% wouldn't drive, wouldn't travel at all. And you can see that overall, we're actually beating that average by several points. So that's so this is more reason to add rail service within the state, given this past data. On to the next slide, please. This induced ridership, like I said, is really valuable. These numbers seem pretty high, right? I mean, $84 per day trip and like over $350 per overnight visitor. I mean, those are significant numbers, and we source these from the from Experience Washington, which is our tourism association, on ridership on numbers that they tabulated over the past year. And so it's pretty remarkable. For those 11% of passengers that would be spending money in different parts of the state, it would be new spending, and all of the places that they would visit would benefit from it. On to the next slide, please. So as you can see, this adds up pretty fast. For just one train a day, again, really just a modicum of service, a bare modicum of service at that, we estimate perhaps $7 million in potential new spending every year created by the train, which is a significant chunk of the annual operations expense. If we go to the next slide, what this would mean for the Elum would be, $350,000 a year, and the Tri-Cities would see about $720,000 in new spending from tourists into the restaurants, into the lodging, into the various tourist elements of their economy. This is very important when we consider recovery from the current rather scary economic conditions that we're in. If we're trying to get ourselves out of that, inducing more tourist travel within the state is certainly a laudable goal. On to the next slide, please. Finally, for the third of passengers or so that would normally fly, they're going to encounter a great deal of savings, which can then be spent on other things in the state. If you're flying, you're looking at about 47 cents per mile. Right now, for the Amtrak Cascades, that number is approximately halved. And so overall, you're looking at a huge amount of savings for a significant portion of the ridership, and that adds up fast as well. We end up looking at about $8 million in saved airfare for Washingtonians. On to the next slide, please. And I jumped the gun there. Yes, if East-West service was enacted, we'd be saving a little over $8 million a year, again, from only one train a day, which is not proper service, which we're going to talk about in a moment. On to the next slide, please. This is really the reality, I think. Right now, our current transportation system is rather hostile in this sense. If you are trying to travel across the state, our attitude is thus, given a paucity of intercity bus service, given the high price of plane tickets, if you can't afford them, then you just have to put tire chains on and drive in rather unsafe conditions from roads that are closed upwards of a dozen times a year. On to the next slide, please. There is a lot of support for this service. That's one positive attribute of the STEER plan, of the STEER report when they published it. They noted that that there was an overwhelming amount of support of the likes that they really hadn't seen before doing similar passenger rail feasibility studies. And most likely, the state's currently rather hostile policy towards people that don't live in the western half of the state probably contribute to the idea of having a more gracious option. On to the next slide, please. So doing a lot of the same numbers here, looking at the road maintenance savings, looking at reduced vehicle fatalities, especially on I-5, which is one of the most dangerous highways in the United States, looking at the pollution savings, looking at airfare saved and the induced visitor spending, with 5 Cascade trains and a couple going to Vancouver and the ones south of Portland. Overall, you're looking in Washington State specifically of a value of around $88 million a year, which is far in excess of what we paid for the service. On to the next slide, please. You can see here that Cascades ridership is been very stable up until the time of the pandemic. We've been bouncing up against about 800,000 passengers every year. And because of that consistency, it means that the service has really been worth a lot. I mean, it's saved us and made us in combination of about $500 million just since 2013, which is again really significant when we think about transportation budgets and what we're trying to accomplish when we fund transportation alternatives. But again, I want you to notice how ridership has been bouncing up against 800,000. And you'll also may have noticed that I've been harping about how the service envisioned to Seattle and Spokane is really a small amount. It's just 1 to 2 trains. On to the next slide, please. So let's talk about this for a moment. Don't be too scared by the graph, but it's really an important concept. Every one of these blue triangles on this graph represents a different passenger rail service in the United States. These are specifically the ones supported by states. And so we're not looking at long distance trains, and we're not looking at the Northeast Corridor. What we are looking at are trains in California. We're looking at our own service in Washington State. We're looking at services in Missouri and North Carolina and all kinds of places like that. Places that have service that is similar to the Cascades. You'll notice there's a pile of triangles in the lower left-hand corner. And you'll notice that those are right around 1 to 2 trains per day. And you'll notice that they're all clustered beneath about 500,000 riders. That steer east-west ridership, because they only contemplated 1 to 2 trains a day, this very minimal startup, this minimal service. This means that they necessarily constrain the amount of ridership potential that corridor has. We think that there might be more than that, but if you're only going to one or 2 trains a day, that just means that you're going to essentially consign yourself to that kind of ridership. If we travel up the curve here, because you'll notice that the statistical correlation between the number of trains per day on a given corridor and the ridership is pretty strong. If we follow up the curve about halfway, we'll hit a blue triangle that is actually marked for the Cascade service. Again, right at around 800,000 passengers. And you'll notice that the other trains in a similar area, because if we combine all the Cascades trains to Vancouver down to Eugene, we come to 7 or 8 a day. You'll notice that they're all around there, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million riders. If we continue up the curve, there are several triangles that are well over 1.5 million and even up to closer to 3 million passengers. And those are the trains that really have exceptional schedules. At the very top of the curve, we have the Pacific Surfliner, which is the most important passenger rail corridor in the United States that isn't in the Northeast and serving Washington, D.C. directly. San Diego to Los Angeles is a huge service. It carries nearly 3 million passengers, and it runs about 13 trains a day. And think about that as a passenger. That means that you basically can show up at any given station along the route, and within an hour, there'll be a train. With our own Cascade service, you couldn't describe it that way. You really had to follow the timetable. If we were to increase the Cascades by those 2 trains and kind of push it up the curve further, there would have been a train every 2 or 3 hours at a given station, which really is a different kind of service when you think about it from a passenger perspective. Suddenly there's a train in every major part of the day, and it's just easier to conceptualize. On the other side of the coin, you've got the kind of steer conception of Spokane passenger service that would be serving Cle, Elum, and Yakima, and the Tri-Cities, pardon me. But, thinking about that service, you really would be confined to just a particular time of day. It would be successful, but its success would be limited given to the inconvenience of how it was scheduled. So on to the next slide, please. If we think about back in 2000 service goals, they envisioned 3 million passengers. And what's amazing is that they also looked at 13 daily Seattle to Portland round trips. This matches consistently with the actual observed data. And it tells us that if we were to really push for the Cascade Service Plan as envisioned originally by the state, we would probably, we've got significant grounding to expect that we would see a huge spike in ridership like this. On to the next slide. Those 3 million passengers would really add up. I mean, right now we see, we see several $1 million in benefits from the Cascades, but suddenly it would push it to being truly significant. You can see how fast this would add up. Over $300 billion a year from people not getting killed on freeways and increased tourist spending. It's really kind of remarkable to think what we could do. On to the next slide, please. These are the various investments that have been dumped into the Cascades corridor. And just to put it kind of in perspective, you can see like the Kelso to Martins Bluff Rail project down there is $469 million. If you go down to the bottom, the east-west predicted improvements, which we think were perhaps inflated, and you can follow up with us about that after the fact. But they see it as around $380 million. Now, in the context, it looks like a big amount. It looks like a big price tag, right? Almost $400 million. But let's go to the next slide, please. The high end of what Steer thought we would need to spend to get trains running between Seattle and Spokane beyond the Empire Builder is somewhere between that number, 380 million at the high end, 280 at the low end. If we think about what we spend right now on transportation investments in this state, suddenly they just get dwarfed. If we look at the southbound HOV lane and down in Tacoma, it's for 2 miles of road, we're looking at a price tag that's nearly the entire corridor between Seattle and Spokane. For 6 miles of the very passes that close a dozen times a year over Snoqualmie, you're looking at almost the exact same price for the lower end estimate. And that's 6 miles versus almost a 400-mile corridor, which would buy a lot of political capital and a lot of happy constituents. So it's just this sort of comparison, and not pitting rail against other rail projects, but thinking about it in context of the entire transportation system is how we generated a lot of these numbers. And it's really how we have to think about this in order to get traction, because what we're looking at here is a bargain. $400 million by itself may not seem it, but overall, with what we already spend, with the huge expenses incurred by WashDOT, it actually is. I think we can go to the next slide, but I think this is the last one for me. Yeah.
Thank you, Abe. Are there any questions? Did you guys keep your pencils sharp? There must be. Did you add up all those numbers? Okay, thanks, Abe. Appreciate that. So back to where we were here now. Luis Moscoso is going to tell us where we're going to go with all this information. Luis?
Great. Would anyone like to take a quick break? We've been at this for almost an hour. Or just run it through to the end. Hearing no request, we'll continue then.
Luis, you might want to respond to the message that Tim Gould put in the chat. I can read it if you like. He says,
yeah, read it out. I'm looking at it too. Go ahead.
Sure. The Growth Management Act updates proposed by FutureWise and other organizations for the 2021 legislature includes some requirements for counties to meet VMT reduction targets in their comprehensive plans. He's suggesting let's support these changes to the GMA and add a climate change response element that includes VMT reduction in county land use codes. So if you have some comments about that, I thought that might be a good starting point for you.
Yes, I'm familiar with that, and I don't see any problem with us, reviewing that and adding our voice to that particular proposal. I would also ask, though, that our friends at FutureWise and other organizations like that start giving a little more attention to helping us promote what we're talking about today. It would really be helpful if in supporting that proposal, which is a good one, that the people are given some of the information that we're sharing today, as well as other things dealing with the Cascades corridor that Abe has mentioned. So I'm looking forward to chatting with Tim later about that, and anyone else he wants to have that conversation with. Next slide. Okay, you can read what's on the slide. What I would like people to understand is that All Aboard Washington has been working on this proposal for the better part of 20 years or longer. And there was a study done back in 2001 for the East-West corridor. It lay dormant on the shelf for a while, mostly because of a lack of funding, particularly with the economic downturn in 2008. And unfortunately, there haven't been a lot of legislative champions as there were back in the 90s when we first, launched the intercity passenger rail program with the Amtrak Cascades. So next slide. And we've been working on this for a while, as I said, and we really need to get more support, especially from Eastern Washington, but also from organizations and folks on the west side, to recognize that we need to connect all of Washington here. The East-West corridor has been long promised, and right now, except for this study that we had done last year, there really hasn't been any other legislative effort discussing this in the past. Next slide. Okay, how to make this happen. Next slide. And we're going to run through this really fast. We have been organizing all these grassroots groups here. We have a lot more folks who are working on this proposal at this time. We've added some new board members recently who've got further reach than we've had up to this time. And we've had some experience in the last 2 years with something called whistle stops, which are evening events that we planned in Olympia with legislators to show just what we're trying to do and why they should be more involved in promoting this. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. That's self-explanatory. Next slide. And the next slide. We've heard mention of some of these entities, jurisdictions in the previous presentation. Just want you to know that All Aboard is connected to them through our Government Affairs Office, as well as direct connections from some of our board members and allies. Next slide. Okay, I think Abe's covered the intent of that pretty well. Again, we need to connect Washington. Eastern Washington has been kind of left out of this for a while, and it's not just a matter of equity, but that's certainly important, that we're involved in a mobility crisis now that's only become worse with the COVID breakdown and the fact of the cost of airlines, and even airlines might be losing a lot of service in the future. People are finally saying, why are we using trains for some of the more shorter distance, under 400 miles or so, that the East-West corridor certainly can fulfill that. Next slide. Okay, I have been very, very focused on trying to remind our legislators that we do have this 30-year mandate to develop high-quality intercity passenger rail service. Sometimes there's a disconnect between saying high speed and higher speed, and with the recent excitement over the ultra-high speed, which is a good thing that All Aboard supports, we seem to be forgetting the intercity connections that we have, that we need to not only continue the service that we've had on the Cascades corridor, but looking at the east-west connections so that we can bring everybody into this network that we promised to do way back in 1992. It's nearly 30 years now since we made this proposal, and we haven't seen a serious enough effort on the state's part to see how just we would get going. This study that Steer just completed and that Abe has shown, what some of the deficiencies might be in that and how we can compensate for that, is the best way to show folks that there is a way to make this thing work, and now's the time to do that. Next slide. Okay, so here we are in terms of what happens in the next biennium. As most of you might know, the Governor, Senate, and House transportation budgets are not available for us to look at just yet. The governor's budget is out next month, the House and Senate will be presenting their transportation budgets in January. We are trying to get a preview of that as soon as possible so that we can help to make sure that what we're talking about is in the budget and will be considered. Likely, if we do not have an opportunity to get direct support, we'll be looking at adding provisos with the help of some of our legislative friends. The number 2 bullet there, next steps to evaluate east-west intercity passenger rail corridor. As the study itself said, in spite of some of the deficiencies, as we mentioned before, the STEER study does call for further investigation of the capital and operating cost, that they do see the need to assess the economic impacts, which, as Abe has shown us, are considerable. And of course, we need to have an overall cost-benefit analysis of the east-west passenger rail service in order to show folks just what the benefit of this long promise has been for Eastern Washington and Washington as a whole. The next bullet point refers to the county rail districts that Louis Musso spoke to already. You know what that's all about. We will resubmit what was House Bill 2622 in 2018 and 2019. We didn't get very far with it that time because of some budget concerns. We couldn't even get it out of the committee. But I think if we're looking for ways to pay for this, this is something that makes sense to show folks that this can be done even in addition to whatever we might get in the final transportation budget that will be hopefully completed by April of this year. Next year, that is. The final budget there, next point is managing the Cascades Corridor. That was a bill that I had back in 2013 when I was in the legislature, authorizing the Oregon and WashDOT and British Columbia to work more closely together. Some of you may be aware of some of the, not just budget, but interjurisdictional issues that have come up, particularly around cost of service on the Cascades Corridor, as well as equipment. And I think that this particular bill was also submitted to the Oregon legislature the same year in 2013. They did pass it, but unfortunately the Transportation Committee in Olympia did not take it up. We'd like to resubmit that as a way to perhaps suggest how some of the current disagreements and misunderstandings between some of the jurisdictions, equipment, and costs, should be settled ahead of time rather than just being legislative debates in Olympia or in Salem, and then after the fact trying to figure out, well, how is this the best for the whole system? We need a more strategic and comprehensive way of looking at all these 3 jurisdictions, having an understanding of what they want at least the Cascades Corridor to look like in the future. And of course, that also sets us up for adding the East-West Corridor. Next slide. We'll go back to the other slide. There was something missing there. We went to put in the Northwest Rail Commission. That will be another ask we're looking for. I'm going to be working with the Legislative Rail Caucus that I helped start back in 2013, so that the members of that particular rail caucus in the 2 House and Senate Transportation Committees can perhaps make that a package that they are also working on with us, so that it can get a little higher level of examination and maybe make it easier to be sure we have a work session and hearings on whatever legislation is necessary to follow through on these particular issues. I see there are some questions coming in. Can Charlie or Patrick help me? Where are we at, and should we answer those now? Okay, I'm looking at them myself.
Let's see. Yes. So
Yeah, Luis, I think we answered except the last 2. Gary asks, would a Northwest Rail Commission help help the last bullet?
The Managing Cascades Corridor?
Yes.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And given what the ultra high speed folks are looking at, their management and funding plan, which is due out December 1st of this year, that some combination or articulation between those efforts will have to be discussed to see if how all three or one might be the better way to go with all of that. We haven't had full discussion of that at this time, but I do think that the Rail Commission, bringing the other states into it, would add a lot more interest and support to see how whatever we do here with the Cascades is part of the overall plan. So, and adding those particular individuals and their organizations and helping to promote, this matter should help us understand the significance of making sure the Cascades corridor, is not delayed in its development in the next couple of years due to the current crisis with the pandemic, budget revenue, as well as equipment shortfalls. Next slide. And this is another question. One more question you said, right?
There's a question there from Barry Green.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'll read it out to you. It says, Awa seems to be having roadblocks placed in front of them by WashDOT's rail division. Is it time for new management at the rail division? Will you be getting any support from your governor?
Well, I'm not sure if I have an answer to that. And if I did, probably this wouldn't be the place to bring it up. But I do accept and understand that there is a lot of miscommunication, misunderstanding between some of the jurisdictions and between the advocacy groups like ourselves and RPA and AORTA, that we've got to all get on the same page here. I think that the main reason for all this confusion is that we have not had strong and dedicated leadership in the legislature, for a number of years now. And even the Rail Caucus that I helped start 7 years ago is still struggling to come together with a package of legislation and priorities that will make a difference in how the transportation budgets are drafted and then passed. So I wouldn't, want to look for any scapegoats or blame anybody in particular. I think that like in any legislative situation, the bureaucratic and political, connections can be rather difficult at times. So by elevating this discussion we have right now and letting other folks who have not been involved in these discussions in the past, especially from Eastern Washington, should make it easier for legislators and for WashDOT in particular to realize there's a lot of support for this. They haven't felt the support in the past, which may have, given them the situation where they can only do what they're asked to do. And if we haven't asked them to do more, expecting leadership to draft legislation, that's not how it works. We could have all kinds of very supportive, rail advocates in the departments of transportation, but if legislators aren't on the same page and aren't giving them something to do, then at best they can talk behind the scenes saying, we want to do more. The rail plans we've seen and the original legislation from the 90s that said we're supposed to do these things. Why aren't you bringing these things forward? And what can we do to help you, in making sure the public understands that there's a very significant need to do these things now. It's been put off for far too long, and the benefits of this rail network that are coming to light at this time make it clear that there's no reason to postpone a collective effort to really address this problem as soon as possible. Understanding that there are budgetary things we're also going to have to think about how to pay for what we now know we really need to do. So the next slide, that slide there, let's make it happen. We are working as we have in the past with our legislators. We do support work with the Rail Caucus. We do our whistle stops in the evening in Olympia. And we also look at supporting some of their work in their legislative lunches focused on transportation. I want to remind folks, I forgot to mention this, that in looking at the budget problem we have in the state of Washington right now, the projected nearly $9 billion hole is now, fortunately, fortunately now expected to be only $4.2 billion. So there's going to be a lot of people, a lot of issues, a lot of programs, struggling to get whatever funding is available. We hope that in looking at the budgets when they come out from the governor and the two chambers, that we can see some light at the end of the tunnel about how they expect to address this. But the biggest problem is for them to understand what Abe was saying before regarding the Cascades dividend, that in order to get back to the pre-COVID passenger service level that we had, that was supposed to start in 2018, that that's going to be a heavy lift. But we know from some of the projections that we've looked at that if we want that service to be as successful as we believe it can and must be, that we can't afford to wait a year or two just to start up that service. The problem at this time, some of you may know, is that there's an equipment shortage, and that's created a whole other set of problems for WashDOT in deciding how much service can we put on possibly next year. I know they'd like to add at least another trip on the corridor if they can find the right equipment and have the money allocated to support that. And that the money may not be there, but we think we've got to find a way to have the legislature realize that not just to save the service, but to make sure that service becomes part of the solution we're looking for during the recovery from COVID and the downturn in revenue and the congestion on I-5, that delaying any service on the Cascades corridor at this time would not be a very smart thing to do. Okay, next slide. Okay, back it up. So in closing, I just want to say that we will be working with the Rail Caucus and other legislators. We've had discussions with the chairs and vice chair of the House Transportation Committee. They are very keen to understand a lot of what we've talked about today. I think that it was a revelation to many of them that in wanting that first steer east-west rail study, they found out a lot of things that they had either forgotten or never told over the last few years, because we haven't had a rail champion in the legislature. And then seeing the other things that we've also been able to uncover in Abe's research on that study, is that it really is time to have a full and complete discussion about how the Cascades rail service and looking forward to connecting Eastern Washington with that other corridor is really necessary at this time. We'll need all the help we can get, and I think as Tim Gould was suggesting, working more closely with those other entities that are looking at the problems around vehicle miles traveled and pollution, all the things related to car travel, that is making sure those audiences who are paying more attention to one mode than the other need to work together, so that people understand that the rail system is part of the overall transportation system, and that we can't make one work better without knowing how to support the other. So any further questions I see coming in?
Patrick, there's one there if you want to read that, I think.
Yes. So the other one, the next question, also from Tim Gold, is the equipment shortage problem partly or entirely due to retiring Talgo train sets? And I'm assuming he's referring to the 6s. The negative view of Talgos on the part of FRA is unfounded, as I understand the objections.
Yes to the first question. Everything is due to the problem of the retiring the Talgo train sets earlier this year. There's no contract between WashDOT and Talgo at this time for any other equipment. The issue around the NTSB report and the FRA's understanding of that, I would agree that there's a number of people in the rail industry who agree that it was unfounded. And that is become more of a political problem now, perhaps, than a practical one. But it being said, it's not something that all aboard, or perhaps any rail advocates, would be wise to step into at this time. That's something for the legislators to appreciate, I guess. But the train sets are gone, and the replacements are not really available or here at this time. We know that there has been some discussion about some train sets sitting in Milwaukee that the FRA and Amtrak, would have thought would be useful out here. The reasons that that's not the case are not the purview of this discussion today, and I don't want to get into that. But unfortunately, because of that that problem in the contract between Talgo and WashDOT. We've now lost a couple of years of service since the derailment, and it looks like if this problem isn't settled, we could be going another couple of years or more until adequate equipment is built for WashDOT. And perhaps, Abe, if you would maybe give an overview of the equipment situation across the country at this time, and what can be done about that, as Amtrak Joe and a lot of other people are saying we need more trains. Can you speak to that, please?
Oh, well,
Just an
it's kind of
overview.
like, yeah, no, it's sort of like trying to cram 1,000 pages into 30 seconds. But basically, given the state of the rail equipment manufacturing industry in this country is not good. It hasn't been good for the last several decades because the demand for equipment has not been consistent, as it is entirely dependent on a beneficent federal government that has not been very beneficent. These contracts are structured in a way where equipment manufacturers have to comply with Buy America requirements. And so essentially what it means is if you're going to be manufacturing rail equipment in the States, you have to get a design that's approved. You have to establish a factory, hire workers, get the production line going, and hammer out problems when you do it. And from anybody in the manufacturing industry could tell you that that process is something that's done over years, and these contractors tend to have mere months to do so. At the end of the contracts, if more contracts do not appear, the factory is then shut down, all the workers are laid off, and we have to start this enormously inefficient process all over again. There have only been a few factories that have managed to survive. The Siemens plant in Sacramento being one of them, has managed to diversify its products, so they make light rail vehicles and passenger cars and engines and things like that, because they've been able to kind of swing from contract to contract. But there are several, the Sumitomo DMU factory, that have not been able to make it out of this environment. So to do this, it's not just like ordering cars and having them roll off the manufacturing line. This is especially dire because the average age of Amtrak equipment, I believe, is 37 years. Now, rail equipment lasts for a long time, but that's getting to the point where everything is fully depreciated, and we're kind of lucky that it's all running. We're at a real inflection point at being able to provide the service, because the other thing that we're doing is, because Amtrak has reduced service because of the pandemic, they've parked a lot of this equipment. Rail cars are like, they're expensive pieces of capital equipment, and they need to be running, rolling around with their juices flowing in order to keep them on the road. When you park them, all kinds of things break, and getting them going again isn't necessarily an easy task. So overall, there needs to be something that the only way to really fix this that exists in the modern policy environment would be to treat trains like you treat any other major mode of transportation, and you provide reliable funding that capital investments can be structured around. If that materializes, and the thing is, it might, the House last year had the best piece of passenger rail legislation pass that we've seen probably since the passage of Amtrak, the passage of the legislation creating Amtrak back in 1970. It was really significant. All kinds of excellent provisions, startup funds to help states get new state-supported service running, real actual funding, more at a level that we see for roads and airports, something that you could actually build with. Of course, it died in the Senate, but if any part of that bill becomes law under this new administration, then we'll be looking at a different environment. However, if Amtrak is still expected to subsist on somewhere between $1 and $2 billion a year, competing in an environment where the airlines are subsisting on $16 billion a year for air traffic control, and the highways just keep on getting $40 billion a year, then we're going to be in this same frenetic kind of sick circumstance. What it means for Washington State is if the Talgo's 8s, which have been provided by Amtrak, are not accepted by the state, then we may be waiting for an there isn't really a hard timeline that we've been presented. It could be several years. For perspective, Illinois has new equipment arriving. This is after its disastrous procurement a process which lasted over a decade for details that we don't need to add, that we don't need to talk about here. The Amtrak's last long distance contract to create new equipment for trains like the Empire Builder and Coast Starlight and the trains, especially the trains east of the Mississippi. Those cars have not all been delivered yet, and they also took about a decade to materialize. Those two examples are especially bad, but it shows you the kind of timeline that actually happens in this country if you're just trying to get a new train set. So, I mean, at the very least, we could be looking at 5 years, hopefully not 10 years, but it's not good.
Thank you, Abe. So the bottom line is, as we are making known the new and better way to look at passenger rail service in the Northwest, and particularly with the Cascades, we need to expand the number of allies and advocates that are going to help us to do this. Everyone wants a train now. The ultra high speed rail, proposal has certainly shown a lot of interest, and everyone is hot to make that happen. But even so, in the last couple of sessions, there's not been enough money to even respond to what they need just to start what they're trying to do. Hopefully, the report that comes out December 1 will have an idea of how they think they can get around that, given the budget situation. And we know at All Aboard that the ultra high speed rail corridors, like they have in Europe and the Far East, are something this country has been decades behind in undertaking, and we support it completely. In the meantime, what are we doing with the state asset we have right now? Because it will take the Amtrak Cascades and whatever we do in Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon, to feed into that ultra high speed line, which at best is 15 to 20 years away. So why aren't we spending the time and effort to make sure that the service we have now continues to grow, connecting all those cities, 18 on the corridor right now, and more cities in Eastern Washington, so that if and when that ultra high speed is finally built, again, maybe almost 2 decades from now, that there's a train culture that people are ready to do that. And with only one stop in the Seattle area, then of course we need to get people to that stop. Having people drive or find some other way to get to the one single stop doesn't make sense when we have intercity trains that can bring people to that stop. I'll admit that there's discussion about having the ultra high speed have more than just that one stop later on. But even if that becomes possible and unlikely, then you're not doing ultra high speed anymore, are you? If you have to have any more stops on that corridor. So that's a whole other discussion that we'd like to have with some of those advocates in our presentation coming up. We're planning a presentation with WashDOT the first week of January that would kind of tie all these things together, looking at the larger network and system we're trying to put together, and showing people where ultra high speed and the Amtrak Cascades really have to be talked about as a set, and working with what we have right now to prepare for that future we all seem to want. So I'm going to leave it right there and say that we are going to have to raise awareness and be a lot more assertive in how we're presenting this information to and expecting results from the legislature and any other transportation groups and individuals, particularly the business community, as they look at what they want to do post-pandemic and people doing virtual work from home now. It even makes more sense that these cities where people are living in right now, why put them back on the road to go to the work centers, particularly in the Seattle area? This is the time to see how the Amtrak Cascades can be part of what there always was supposed to be, as people are realizing the benefits of a train network. So any other questions I'm seeing there? I think some are coming in.
Yeah, they're mostly comments, I think, at this point.
Yeah.
The one question that you had was, post-pandemic, will WashDOT and Amtrak not have enough equipment to even restore 2019 levels of service?
Yeah, I think Abe has kind of answered a lot of that. We understand that WashDOT wants to bring in some of the equipment from Amtrak, surplus equipment that they have right now. But some of that is also a question of funding, whether they have the money to operate even a second train in the corridor right now. So they can probably, cobble together, a train set, hopefully find the money to run that. But it certainly isn't optimal and not what we're looking for. We need to really discuss what is the best thing we want to get to, and let's figure out how we can do that in the next few years. Um, other than that, I don't think that I can really speak to that question any further. We're not going to get back to the pre-pandemic service, in the next 2 years. I'm pretty sure, for lack of equipment and funding.
Mhm. Just to add to that briefly, my understanding is that the Horizon equipment that WashDOT is currently working with in replacement of the Talgo 6s is still going to be Amtrak's equipment. And if Amtrak does restore things at all, it could be pulled, and we would be far short of equipment needed for 2019 services, let alone the services that WashDOT has been promising for a number of years and still has yet to expand on.
Right, and then we understand that Amtrak or FRA has said that our service will go to the head of the line in getting new equipment whenever that's happening. And as Abe pointed out, that could be a minimum of 3 to 5 years from now. Not a lot to bank on or to certainly even rely on. So we've got some challenges here. I think the biggest challenge is to make sure that the legislature understands that this program has been allowed to drift at best for a number of years now, at least since 2006 with the last significant rail plan they had. And it's time to really take a look at what do we want and how are we going to get there, because we can't just limp along with used equipment from Amtrak as if we want to have a true alternative to people driving their cars or using airfare and air transportation to get to other points, even in the Northwest. I'm reminded of a comment I saw on a transportation post in social media a year or so ago, where somebody from the high-tech industry was complaining about the time it took to drive from the east side to SeaTac and getting through traffic and then getting through all the rigmarole of trying to get on the plane. And they're only going to Portland. And it turned out that they were fogged in, so they were waiting even longer. And the time it took for them to do all of that just to get to the SeaTac and wait for a possible plane to Portland, they could have been there on the Amtrak Cascades, hours earlier. I don't know why people aren't considering that, why the interest in, especially in some of the high-tech areas of just, quickly moving between Vancouver and Seattle and Portland is important to them for reasons we understand. But to consider that the transportation system, has to prioritize, that particular effort, which should be there, over the fact that there is another service right now that could bring people into the system. We've got to raise their awareness and their consciousness that using the Amtrak Cascades and providing more service would ameliorate all those problems they have with traffic right now as they wait for the ultra high speed to come some years in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Any other questions? Okay, hearing none. Charlie, we could have the next slide. Would you like to tell us about the last event in our series?
Yes, certainly. The next event will be the train trek to Auburn on Saturday, December 5th, same time, 1:00 p.m. We are hoping to end the series on the west side of the Cascades. We'll be hearing from how the east-west system can be connected to existing services. And so stay tuned for that. And as Luis also mentioned, there will be another event probably in January. We're still working on the time and location for that. And so please stay tuned. We'll have more information for you on that. The good news is that although there are lots of things that are somewhat discouraging, there are a lot of things happening locally, regionally, and nationally that could potentially be very positive. So we're hoping in the next couple of months to be having more information for you. So keep track of us on social media, on our website, and in email. And we hope that everyone has a safe and enjoyable Thanksgiving and holiday season.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you everyone for attending. If there are any final questions. Okay, thank you, everybody. See you on December 5th. Happy Thanksgiving.